Awesome. Thank you so much, Alaya, for being here. We've really enjoyed hearing your contributions so far this conference, and we're just so glad you can join us from Mexico. To get us started off, I have a question from some of our viewers. They'd like to know, what are your favorite books?
Always like the most fraught question. Like I like that right off the bat. I love so many books, but probably my like the touchstone novels that I just keep coming back to, the writers that I keep coming back to. Guy Gabriel Kay was one of my like early loves, and I just kind of never stopped loving his work. He just continues to produce absolutely brilliant works of historical fantasy. That like every time I read them, I learn something new about writing, and I just love it. And Diana Wynne Jones, also when I was growing up, like huge touchstone for me. All of her young adult novels are just so they really form the foundation of so much of what's going on now in YA,
Mm,
especially speculative YA. And I just think they're absolutely still hold up every bit as much. I just reread Hell's Moving Castle, and it's just brilliant. So yeah, I loved her. I loved yeah, like, I feel like every time I answer this question, there's always like the other 20 authors I don't mention like screaming like on my bookshelf, like why have you abandoned me? So I always feel like so terrible because I know I'm gonna forget somebody like pivotal. Um but the newer writers, Sophia Samatar, A Stranger in Alondria is one of the best books I've ever read. I find it like astonishing, just astonishing. I love that book so much. Just brilliant, brilliant. And see, this is where everybody starts screaming. So like, Dorothy Dunnett, those the Lyman Chronicles was one of those novels that just like I continue to try to do things that it was doing like so effortlessly. Octavia Butler, especially Kindred, in its own way, Fledgling, her last novel, are like real touchstones for me. Also, I love those books. Many more. This is so bad. Maybe we can like circle back around at the end. I'll like remember others.
sure. No problem. It's a hard one to answer because I feel like so many books really shape who we are, and so it's kind of tough at the spur of the moment to list all of the ones that impacted you, right?
Right, right. Oh, Ursula Le Guin. Okay, all right.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Tell us, how long have you been writing, or when did you start?
Um, I mean, in the sense of I imagined myself, I like fancied myself a writer. Very young, honestly. It was around the time I figured out what a novel was. So I was like 6-ish, 7. I had like a kind of this vague but very defined notion on its own way that I wanted to do that. So I probably tried the first one when I was 7 or 8, like around 8,
Wow.
I think. I mean, obviously, this is nothing to. I was no child prodigy, really. I just was totally determined. So I tried writing it in a notebook, and then I got really tired of that. Like my hand got cramped, and so
Yes.
I was like, no, 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 this is for the birds. I wanna like talk it. So I found like an old cassette tape that my dad had lying around. And yeah, I don't know, like the old days, or we would like put tape over
Right.
the like holes that with the cassette tape so you could record. So I did that, and then I recorded it. And I forgot all about it, and then like 6 months later, my dad was called me to his office, like, "What happened to my Vivaldi tape?" And I was like, "You're what?"
Oh no.
So, he was like listening to classical music, and suddenly my voice interrupts it with my story.
I bet it's priceless now, though. That's really neat.
Yeah.
When you're writing, what's the most difficult part of your writing process?
All of them. they're they're all uniquely difficult in their own way. I curse them all individually. I don't know. It's right now, for example, I'm deep in a very long revision. It's been a year. So right now I would tell you that the revision process is the hardest part of writing. But and maybe that's true. I feel like there's also like a moment in the revision that I adore, and it always comes after like the tearing my hair out and cursing things. where I realize that I finally done it, or like I figured it out, and I go, yes, yes. I mean, it's just like joy, gold, you know. But before that, it's a slog.
Mm.
So I think maybe right now I'll just honor the fact that I've been doing this for a year and it's really hard. So definitely revising.
All right. Do you have any particular advice you would give to one of our younger viewers who's working on their first book?
um, well, number one, I guess I'd say try not to doubt yourself too much. Writing is forgiving in the sense that you can always go back and fix it. So, you know, I sometimes I feel like the one of the mistakes I most see younger writers making is that they're achieving, or they're aiming for this totally impossible goal of perfection. You know, the idea that, like, you know, if I do this, it has to be as good as my favorite writers. I mean, but take it from me, even your favorite writers write not fabulous first drafts. I mean, what you have read is the product of them working and working and working. So your first draft is not going to be as good as their final drafts. Nobody's first draft is as good as their final drafts, okay? So, you know, cut yourself some slack and try to finish it. Because I've known writers that will polish and polish and polish and have like pristine, glorious, the most like gym like first three chapters and nothing else. You know, they just have a perfect first three chapters, and you know, maybe you are content with your perfect first three chapters. But I think most of us, when we want to write a novel, it's because, well, you know, we want to finish the novel. So like, let it be bad. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah,
Even if you never use it, even if you throw it in the drawer, you've learned so much just by getting to the end of it.
that's really great advice. I really love that. And I think that's applicable to a lot of different creative fields too.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
personally an artist, and I feel like that with any art process as well.
Yeah.
Do you try to be more original or to deliver to readers what you think they want?
On that in that particular spectrum, I'm definitely on the side of like just do what I feel like and try to be as original as I can. I will say I'm not trying to like pull a gotcha on the reader either, you know. But it is important to me to push my own boundaries, to go places where maybe I've always wanted, the stories that I've loved to, or you know, or other stories I read, you know, or I might like constantly look at a kind of story and say, you know, this is fine, but I just wish that for once they would deal with this issue. You know, I just wish that for once they wouldn't stop at this point where everything seems so easy, and they you would see all the messiness that comes afterward. You know,
Mm,
and so that tends to be those kind of wedges, those little gaps, tend to be where I feel my inspiration, where I just want to be able to do something different. And so that I think that it's absolutely true that for me, like this desire to take something that I understand or that I've seen a lot, but like do something that speaks really specifically to me, and that is something that I feel like I have my own take on it, like my own contribution to make. Like that's what really
mm,
excites me. And so I mean, while it's absolutely its own skill and totally worthy to be able to like just like with finesse and competence deliver um, something that readers want and expect. And I myself love reading stories like that. I mean, I'm definitely not like, you know, whatever, like everything, if it's not original, it's trash, you know. But I personally, as a writer, have a very hard time like exciting myself or as long as it takes to write. And that's the thing, like the most formulaic novel that you could imagine still took that writer like a ton of time and energy and dedication. You know, it's not like it gets super easy just because that's what you're doing. If anything, there's, you know, it has its own tricks and pitfalls, right? Because if the reader has
right.
read a lot of them, then that means that reader's going to be very, very demanding about you doing it well.
Really insightful. When you are creating, what comes first for you, the plot or the characters, and why?
Um, for me, the plot and the characters are like so inextricably linked that I'm always kind of stymied by these questions, because I'd say some of my stories are a little more well, I'm gonna put it like this. I probably have two kinds of ways of coming up with stories. Whereas, like, let's put character like right in the middle because the characters are tend to be very important, but like always to me. But I'll either have stories where I'll end up with like the world and the characters like really clearly, and the plot kind of wanders in later, or I'll have the plot and the characters, and the world is sort
Mm.
of like slowly layered on that. But the characters, if there isn't even like a glimmer or a shape, because not always that I necessarily understand everything about that person, but there's usually some kind of kernel or core conflict, a kind of core character trait that's what begins to hook me, and that usually brings along with it like the idea of a plot or the idea of a setting. So for my novel Trouble the Saints, it was very much plot character, and the idea for the
Mm.
world and like this kind of 1940s New York, and even like the business with like the magic system and the hands that I layered in after I kind of had this like core idea of the character and and the plot, so like that. But whereas my novel The Summer Prince, it was totally the opposite. I was all about that world and the character, so I think
Yeah.
that's probably, yeah, the best way I can answer
All right. How many hours a day do you write on average?
that. I wish I were a more like steady writer. This is one of those things where in my ideal world I wake up and I drink my tea and I write for hours, but this is not what ever happens. So um before the pandemic I had a bit more structure, which was I would at some point go to the coffee shop and I would try to get there before 2 p.m. and I would write for about like 3 or 4 hours, and that would be like the biggest chunk of my actual writing time. I mean, outside of those hours, I would have a lot of brainstorming sessions and maybe think about things, but that was like the kind of core. I find that unless I am really deep in kind of the end stage of the novel where everything starts to feel like this kind of like downhill rush, or you're just like you know exactly what's happening, and I'm like giddy with desire to like finish it. Um, I can't productively write longer than 4 hours. The problem is, like I said, I'm not that regular. So what will end up happening is that I'll have like a good run of 3 or 4 days, and then I'll kind of like lie fallow a bit. I might think
Uh-huh.
about things and draft, but I'm just not. I just can't. And it was easier in pre-pandemic days because the coffee shops kind of allowed me this kind of like external accountability space. I find it harder to write in where I live. Um,
Mm.
so I had to learn that, like, totally. I've had to, like, totally readapt, my writing style and schedule in order to be able to write in the space I'm living, which I've more or less figured out, but it continues to not be as regular as I wish. So yeah, like, I mean, say, like, 3 or 4 hours a day is my ideal, but I'll probably do that, like, 3 or 4 days in a row. Then it's, like, 2 or 3 days I'm doing kinda other thinky things, and then I'll do another 4-day stretch.
Sure. I think that's true for a lot of us as well. COVID's been hard to work around.
Yeah.
Can you can you tell us a little bit about the research process you do before beginning a book or during your writing process?
Right. I tend to be a bit more research as I go. Sometimes I try to dig into it a little more beforehand. Ironically, I'm now learning exactly why I did not do that as much because I for years now, I mean for like more than a decade, I've had this like idea for kind of a Mexican history inspired fantasy novel. And
Oh,
that was like,
fun.
and that was exactly where my initial interest came in the history of Mexico and the Mexica Empire. Otherwise known as the Aztec Empire, and all of the just like this amazing cultural history, and so I got really into this, and I kept planning it and I kept researching it, and then I got like a little grant from the Speculative Literature Foundation to do research for it, and I went to Mexico for the first time with that grant. Yeah, now like a decade ago, and And I remember I thought to myself two things, like, I love Mexico. I love this place. And also I need at least like 3 more of these trips and I need to learn Spanish, you know? And so that was the beginning of everything that has ended with me spending the last 7 years living here, and I getting a master's degree, and I continue to have not actually written this novel because now I just I've written all sorts of other novels, but like the Mexico novel just like continues to elude me because now I have like a whole master's degree worth of knowledge and I like cannot seem to figure out how to translate that into the book. Um, so you know, if I research as I'm going, my research is a little more targeted, and so I don't end up quite having this interesting dilemma. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure eventually I will manage to write some kind of Mexico history inspired fantasy novel, but I'm not sure what form it will take because like all of that research kind of has like rewired my brain, and that's wonderful
For
and great, and
sure.
I do not regret it. But I will say, like, if I think that writing for me fiction like does require like a kind of more focus on fiction. Um,
Mm,
but like no learning is wasted, and the more kind of different things I learn, the more nuanced and kind of better the worlds I create, no matter what are, so that's how
right.
I look at it. So it's like even if I'm not necessarily researching for writing, like it's all grist for the mill. It's all like kind of part of like this compost of my imagination, and so I just roll with it.
That's fabulous. I love, by the way, how this one trip for a grant ended up with you moving there for so long and starting this whole change in your life path. That's beautiful. I
Yeah.
love learning, so I just love that you embraced it so wholeheartedly.
Yes.
Um, is it possible, out of the books you've written, to share which one's your favorite, or do you love them all equally in different ways?
I mean, I love them all equally in different ways. I mean, I don't know. I guess let's put it like this. Personally, I have this kind of deep connection with each one, and I have a lot of like sympathy and love for the version of me that wrote each of them. Right.
Mm,
In terms of the ones that right now I'm kind of most proud of, or that I feel like I'm just really glad that I managed to write them. Uh, I'm very proud of Trouble the Saints, which just came out. I feel like if I had to pick one, it's always the one I just did because I finally managed it. But for real, I mean, Trouble the Saints was 7 years of work. I mean, not necessarily straight through. I was writing other things. I wrote a master's thesis, so in Spanish. So there were other things happening, but it was definitely kind of the longest stretch I'd ever done on one project. And there were definitely times when it felt like I didn't know how I was going to manage it. So the fact that I did, I'm like super proud of myself, and I'm glad because it's a story that I feel genuinely like truly I could tell that story and that kind of story. And do the things I want to do with it. That's very much one of those things where I'm like, I want the story to go beyond where they normally end. Like where the noir novel ends, and like you're like covered in, gore and like the violence. Like it's kind of like, after all that long tension, there's this kind of like explosion of cathartic dark violence, and then everything, curtains. And I'm like, what is goes on after those curtains? Like that to me was so
right.
important, to really deal with the aftermath of that. And so that was what I ended up doing, with that novel. It has its first act, and then it has like this very different kind of take on its second and third acts. And I mean, to me, like that, I am proud of that. I'm for real. And the other, Love is the Drug is another one that I'm really glad, uh, that I managed to do something that was like so different for me, and deal with like my hometown, Washington D.C. in a way. Very weird now that it's a pandemic novel, that I wrote so many years before the pandemic, and now it's people are like emailing me like, "Did you, Alaya, are you like pre?" I'm like, "No, I'm not at all. If anything, my pandemic is like so easy compared to this one."
I want to talk some more about your most recent book then, Trouble with Saints. Could you pick one of your favorite parts of the book that was the most fun to write? Do you get on a
Yes.
creative high at certain points in your story?
Yeah. I think for me, the like probably like the most like the richest, most delicious creative high for that story was in the second section. So this is like I'm gonna like attempt not to spoil it, but to describe it. Um, each section of the novel has three sections with three different narrators, but it follows the same story with like this kind of anchor character, Phyllis Green, aka Phyllis LeBlanc. And so the first section is from her point of view, and the second section is from the point of view of her former lover, sometime lover, very complicated partner, Dev. And Dev has a really interesting role to play because he basically, when I was writing it, I wrote a first draft, right? I wrote the first draft, and I it was more or less like a straightforward tale of what happened after all the violence ended, and they were in upstate New York, and it was fine, but it wasn't really like popping off the page, and it was just kind of there. And in fact, everybody told me that it was kind of like the weakest link of the story, and I'm like, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? And then I got like this bomb in my brain, and I thought to myself, wait a second, like this whole story, these two characters, like Dev and Phyllis, are constantly lamenting and talking about, oh, that time 10 years ago when you tried to like save me from myself and steal me from the city, and it didn't work and everything ended horribly. And I'm like, they keep going back and they keep talking about it, but I don't actually show any of it. And then I think to myself, wait a second, what he was doing back then when he was trying to save her and steal her from the city is nothing like what she thought he was doing. As a matter of fact, I don't think she has any idea what he was doing. Even now, I feel like he sat down and told her. So when that like light bulb went off, because when I was just drafting the first section from her point of view, it kind of didn't matter whether like how much like she understood of what his story was. But when I was in his head, all of that became so important. And so I went back and I said, so let's just imagine, let me just go back and see, like, what did this look like from his point of view? And the whole story just like came to life. I was just like sort of dancing in my head. Like every time I
Oh,
went to
wow.
write those scenes, I was like, oh, I was like a little girl, like, I'm so excited because it was exactly what I love. That kind of like kaleidoscopic, fragmented view of that different people have when they're looking at the same scene, and even two people who deeply love one another, who understand one another very well, who like have a deep understanding and even like knowledge of each other's history. And even so, there's this whole swath of things that she basically doesn't ask him about, and he doesn't volunteer. And so when I put those flashbacks in, they just elevate. And it's not like they were a huge chunk of text, but it was a revision that just by adding that, I was able to elevate so much of his voice in the present also. And so the whole thing came together, so that to the point that when my editor, because I did this revision before we submitted it to editors and before it sold. And so my editor, when she was going into it for her round of revisions, she said, well, we don't have to do much about the dev section. That's obviously like perfect and the best one. And I was like, oh my God, you have no idea.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I have a question from one of our viewers. Mike Bishop asks, in Trouble the Saints, what inspired the Saints' hands? Is that something you came up with?
It's something that I came up with, but it has its kind of like thematic roots, or it's sort of a riff in the same key. Let's put it like that, of a lot of kind of traditional magic systems. It has its roots in the idea of conjure in Black communities, where people would actually have kind of like little sachets or like kind of herbs that had specific magical properties, and they would call those hands, and they were like for luck, right? So it's exactly the same way that the saints' hands work in the story. In that sense, it's like it's a little something extra that, in the case of the novel, that kind of like that the ancestors kind of bestow upon people from marginalized communities, and it's kind of in their hands, and it allows them to manipulate things or to have certain uncanny effects. And it's nothing big. It's a kind of almost like kind of glorified parlor magic, but that together, like fingers on a hand, those people with saints' hands could become a force that's capable of really toppling like larger power structures, which don't have any magic because they got all the power anyway. That was really what I was going for. So it was kind of like this metaphor of the power of marginalized voices, of groups of our ancestors, of that kind of force, that moral weight to make things right, but also like pitted against this desperate need to survive in violent systems that are maybe not by design, but certainly in effect, systems that often pit us one against another in marginalized groups
Mm.
and make the incentives to put someone down in order to climb up a little bit, sometimes a little too appealing, for a lot of people. And so it's very hard, even though we sometimes do have our own power, our own magic, our own little bit of luck, to actually use that in a way that forwards or that helps everybody instead of just ourselves. That's definitely like the kind of central struggle of Phyllis LeBlanc, Phyllis Green in Trouble with the Saints. So that was kind of how I drew it down. And then of course, the more I did this research, which was very targeted research because I did not want to get a master's degree again. And it was definitely, when I started reading about the numbers, how they would play policy, which was basically like picking numbers from like the mutuels, like a random number generator that you get from the newspaper, and people would bet on the day's numbers, and if somebody hit, then they would get like a little extra, and then there were numbers runners. It spawned a whole culture, like a whole black middle class came out
Mm.
of a lot of those years, and people would have dream books, like actual books of interpretations of their dreams and what numbers if you have a pineapple in your dream, it means like, the number 22. I mean, they would have
Wow.
um all sorts of ways of divining, of using cards, of tarot or regular card decks, which also plays in the novel. And so all of that like kind of like came into this kind of original spark of the idea I had about the hands. And it all kind of dovetailed, even though frankly from the beginning, I just kind of had this like idea in the back of my head. And then I found all of this other historical detail that just like made it so much richer. um, because it seemed like I was kind of mining a vein, like where it was like someone had almost told me, like look over there, and so I looked over
Right.
there, and there was just so much there.
I love that, how you compare it to, like, mining a vein. Oh my goodness, that's a really wonderful visual about your creativity. We have another question. Of the 3 primary characters, P, Dev, and Tamara, which is your favorite?
Ay, another one of these. What? I love them all equally. Um, I can't. I don't know. I love them all in a sense that in order to write this novel, which was such a character driven novel, I really had to be able to get into um like their weaknesses like very deeply, but in a way that in order to create that empathy with the reader for these three very flawed characters, right? Like all three of them are making very bad decisions often. Um, like in order for that to work, like I also had to understand like very well why they had made those bad decisions, why they were making those bad decisions. And also, like the really like wonderful and beautiful things about them. And so it really is hard. It's hard for me to say. I will say that probably in some ways, the character whose journey feels kind of close to mine in a lot of ways is Tamara. Um, and she's a complicated character in her own right, and she comes in at the end of the novel in third person. So you're not quite as close into her point of view. As the other two, and I think it creates like an interesting effect. But there was definitely the way that I was when I really got into it, because she took me a long time to understand as a character, and when I did feel this kind of click, like, oh, I didn't want to deal with her issues, because I felt kind of embarrassed, like in the sense that I felt that her issues were things that I kind of was dealing with too, or something. So I don't know if that's favorite, but I certainly I feel like close to Tamara in that way.
That's interesting because the next question was going to be which character do you feel like you relate to, and you already hit
Yeah.
on that. Um, let's see what we have next. What is a significant way your storyline changed from the first draft? Or was it
Okay.
all pretty much just refining and you had all the essential elements already beautifully in place, and was it just working on semantics?
Not exactly. It's weird, this kind of rewriting, because I'll spend, years sometimes rewriting, and then I'll look back and I'll say, what changed in the plot? And I can pinpoint like tiny things, but like honestly, the overarching plot is like more or less the same, and I'm just like, what was I spending so much time doing? Um, I think it's much more than semantics, but sometimes it's like the thing that I needed to work on wasn't so much like A, B, C, D, like the progression of plot points, so much as how those tied together, how those tied to like the beats of the characters. And like character beats are not things that are you can usually like explain in a plot synopsis. So it always ends up making me feel like, did I do anything at all? Except I did, because before it didn't work at all and now it does, right? In terms of just straight plot that I changed between the first draft and the last, um, most of that very like most of like the actual plot stuff changed in Tamara's section. My first draft, it was a very kind of quiet, straight up like literary kind of meditative, melancholic sequence of these sort of just like moments of her friendship with Phyllis. And it it was on its own. It was like very pretty and lovely, and it did carry some of the character. I mean, from the very beginning, it carried some of those character beats that I always wanted it to have, but it felt very thin, after this kind of like super intense, high octane intensity of the first and second. And I always wanted the third part to be quieter, but it was one of those things where you had to like measure it, because like up here it was like so intense and then it was so quiet. And I kind of had to like, you know, I had to make it match with the other two. And so that definitely required me to actually like add a character. And then Tamara, like at the beginning, didn't, in my first draft, she wasn't like this oracle character that she later on became. She didn't like have the cards that her great aunt had given her, and this ability to kind of like divine with them and read the numbers. And when I added that in, it was one of those things where you add like a character element and it totally changes the plot, like just naturally. Just like I gave her like a thing to do, and her entire section changed. And so I really had to work with that. So it was one of those things where, in fact, a lot of like the individual scenes even then stayed the same. Like they're sitting by the river, they're eating candy apples, they're like exchanging these stories, but they're in a context that's really different of her actually, like, even though it seems quieter, she's being visited by ghosts, she's kind of being haunted, and she has to like make a decision um about her role as an oracle, her role as kind of always standing and watching instead of deciding or taking a stand in a certain way, and that becoming the central question of her character and her story did necessitate me changing the actual plot in a more obvious way. Um, Even so, like I'm looking back, I'm like, I'm still kind of astonished that I didn't change more. But it's just strange how revisions, you can sometimes change everything, and it doesn't, it's like magic, you just made it better.
Great. Natasha Watts asks, how do you maintain your sense of wonder as a writer of speculative fiction?
Ooh, I mean, I think that I feel like the secret to maintaining your sense of wonder as a writer is just like maintaining your sense of wonder as a human. I feel like I just need to tap into that kind of feeling of joy or of discovery of like interest, of just like what sparks me, what's making me like so excited to exist today, and like Lord knows that's not every day you can manage that, but I think that's kind of the heart of what I take to my writing. Like reviewer of Trouble the Saints mentioned, that it was kind of like this long meditation on the nature of love. And I thought, that's really true. Like it's not like I'm not it's funny because it's true. Like one of like my chief preoccupations as a writer is love. And not just romantic love, although I'm, plenty interested in romantic love, but like all kinds of permutations of love, and what that means for two people to love one another and yet still be, mired in these violent systems and still make bad decisions and still sometimes act in ways that aren't particularly loving. like how that shapes us, you know. So that to me is one of those things that if I can bring that to my fiction, if I can reproduce a little bit of that that joy, but also the kind of like bittersweet feeling.
Mm,
You know, to me, that's a day's work. You know, like that's my sense of wonder. That's my joy. And I, you know, maybe one day it'll be something else that inspires me like that. I don't know. You know, now I'm in an interesting place where I've written a lot of books. You know, like I've written not like some wild number of books, but for me, this feels like a solid number of books. And so I don't know what's going to happen next. You know, I figure at some point, you know, I just have to keep trying to find things that challenge me. Lord knows there's still plenty of that left. So I guess that's kind of how I keep trying to I put it in there. If I feel too cynical or kind of like I'm just doing this because I need to do it because of the deadline, like it's a disaster. So I usually try to do everything I can to give myself a break if that starts happening.
nice. That's good. If you could meet your characters, what would you say to them?
Hmm. I would say like, you know, I don't know. I love Phyllis. I think she's very cool. She's also like one dangerous person. So I think um like, you know, she might, you know, I might say to her, so, you know, how are you planning on getting out of this? I think, you know, I think that this you might have made some bad choices. You know, like I kind of have a friend, but you know, I don't know. Some of them, some of my characters, I feel like with Tamara, you know, I could definitely sit her down and say like, listen, you're not. This isn't what you think you're doing. Is not what you were actually doing. Like you are playing mental games with yourself, and the sooner you realize that, the more happier you're going to be. You know. Uh, and probably with probably Deb, I would just say like, you know, you don't have to be that hard on yourself. It's okay.
Um, what other authors are you friends with, and how do they help you become a better writer?
Ooh, I've been lucky to have like all sorts of wonderful author friends who've helped me out so much in all sorts of different ways. You know, one of my best writer friends is Justine Larbalestier, author of Liar, and My Sister Rosa, and you know, I love talking to Justine because she really gets those fallow periods, those I want to write something, but I can't quite figure it out and nothing is working at all. And so we can definitely like get together and like complain a lot. And it like that feels cathartic and wonderful. And I have a whole writing group, or you know, back when I was living in the States and we would meet in person, Altered Fluid, which is like a New York based writing group, and there's all sorts of wonderful writers in it, like Sam Miller, um, and Kay Jemison, and and a bunch of other really great writers. And like they've just been my rock. Like I mean, really being able to always have kind of a group of friends that go to conventions with you. They can, you know, it's interesting because when you're writing full time, especially, you know, it's like kind of isolating, and it's really
Sure.
great to be able to have people to go to the conventions with, to go to readings with, to like just have like kind of your group. Because I remember when I started out, I didn't know anybody, and I just was so isolated and just confused because everybody seemed to know everybody else, you know. So that's been hugely helpful to me, and also obviously like, you know, being able to get critiques from writers in all different stages of their careers, and skill levels is also so hugely important, especially when you're starting out.
I love that. What would you say is the best money you have spent as a writer?
See, the tricky part of this question is the idea that there is like much to be able to spend this money on. You know, I mean, when I was living in New York, I'll tell you, it was all rent. That money went to rent. Um, I'm
New
not.
York is pretty pricey.
Yeah, it's pretty extreme. So I mean, probably I would say the best money I spent as a writer was the money I spent to get myself down to Mexico in order to kind of reboot my life. That was by far the most drastic decision I made, and the one I'm the happiest with. So,
Yeah, that's pretty drastic, and it sounds like it's been absolutely amazing.
yeah, no, it's been amazing, like truly. I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to get a degree, to get to learn a new language, to have this experience, to have been welcomed in this way, in a different country, different language. I mean, really, it's just absolutely changed so much of how I think about the world, and even my own writing. Like I said, even though I haven't written this giant Mexico novel, and who knows when or how I'm going to manage it, like just having done that, and it was very much like a leap of faith. I didn't have enough money to do it by degrees. It was very much like, all right, I'm gonna see what happens. It was totally worth it. So.
Wonderful. We have another question from Natasha Watts. She says, how do you decide which of your story concepts become short stories and which ones become novels?
Um, Most of the time, I kind of have an idea that like this idea is the kind of idea that works for a short story. Like it just doesn't have usually I would probably say the difference is that it doesn't have as much world building attached to it. Doesn't have as much because as I said, like I end up with kind of character and world. Kind of the more complex the world intends to be, like how complex the plot ends up becoming, just to be able to like touch on as much of that world as I can. So if I get an idea that's like a little less complex, I can think like, oh, okay, this is a short story. But I will say with Trouble the Saints, I thought that it was a novelette. I mean, I wrote it in the first section, I wrote it, and I just kept going like, this doesn't work, this is not working, because, in that case, it wasn't so much like the world was too big. It was more like the thematic stuff I wanted to touch on. Like I just couldn't do in the constraints of that kind of neat noir narrative. Like I wanted to write a noir story, but I wanted to also explode the noir story. And to do that, I needed to like write a book, like, you know. So sometimes I don't know. Basically sometimes I think I know and then I'm wrong.
All right, our next question is, other than your big masterpiece on Mexican fantasy merging, how many other unpublished or half-finished books do you have that you're currently stewing over mentally or working on currently?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So if we're talking like not really, but like the unpublished books that I've given up on, like the trunk novels are legion. The ones that I'm trying, I'm thinking about. Basically, when I think about a novel, I'll often just keep it in the back of my head. Like I don't tend to have a lot of kind of drafts lying around. Although I will say the Mexico novel, I did write a solid 60,000 words of that, which I will not use anymore. They're just 60,000 practice words. That's all. So yeah, it's a journey. I also have, I'm working on this YA novel, the one that I've been editing for a year. So that one is nearing. It's kind of like getting to a point where it's actually going to be ready for publication. So um, that's great. And then after that, I have a couple of other ideas. I have like a YA novel, like a kind of sequel to the one that has been a year of revision that I'm really excited about, and I have another adult novel which would be like a little smaller, and maybe the first novel that would actually like kind of directly bring in a bit of my experience in Mexico. So that's really exciting. But both of those are still in the my head stage. I haven't done more than like write a few lines about them. I just kind of let things like sit and marinate for a long time. So I'm not sure if that counts as you know having a novel like kind of like waiting around for publication. It's just like it's but I try not to do that because I feel that if I really sit down and write things like more concretely, then I'll just get really confused and start writing it and abandon the thing that's causing me all sorts of problems and headaches right now, because like what's better than something shiny and new? So I try to be really disciplined about it.
Sure. We have another question from Mike Bishop. He asks, now that you've learned Spanish and written your thesis in Spanish, are you going to write a book in Spanish?
I do not think so. I think it is. People ask me this here too, and I'm like, listen, I would love to have a novel translated into Spanish. I would love to, I've written like a kind of autobiographical short story in Spanish, and it was very hard. It's totally different writing academic Spanish and writing kind of more colloquial Spanish for fiction. I mean, I'm a very proficient Spanish speaker, but like there is a gulf between proficient Spanish speaker as a second language and can write, sustained narrative fiction. Like I haven't quite bridged it. And I think, to be honest, the reason why is because I always spend a significant chunk of my day thinking and writing in English because that's what my native language and that's my livelihood. And I think in order to bridge this kind of last gulf, I would have to be thinking pretty much all the time in Spanish and writing in Spanish. I'd have to really kind of fast on English for at least 6 months to a year, I think, to be able to do that.
Right. How do you balance making demands of your readers and taking care of your readers?
Great question. Often I lean way too heavily on the side of demands of my readers, which I'll try to walk back a lot in my revisions. I'll definitely have editors basically speak up for the reader and be like, Alaya, you know that this makes no sense. Like whatever, they'll figure it out. So I try to strike a balance. I mean, part of it is that I think it really depends on the reader how much they feel comfortable with being kind of left out to sea and figuring things out. As a reader, I do love that feeling of a writer. I mean, in order to feel that way, I have to feel that the writer is totally in control of what they're doing, that they know where they're going. And when I feel that kind of security in their hands, those moments where I'm like, what is happening? I mean, I mentioned the Lyman Chronicles at the beginning, and in one of the books, now I wish I could remember which. I think it's the third book. What is the third book called? The Disorderly Nights. I think that's the third one. So in the third book, there's a scene where you just see a character, and this character comes out, and he's like this strange kind of like totally garrulous, like kind of like off his rocker Spanish noble, and he's like screaming up at like the ramparts of a castle, and like just like, and everyone is just kind of laughing at this guy, like, who is this fool? I mean, he's total Don Quixote kind of figure, just like, what on earth? And I remember like getting to this scene and going, what am I reading? And then you keep going, and like, what am I reading? And it just was like, what? And I just kept going because I was like, oh, I'm sure, it's funny. I'm sure at some point I'll have some idea what I'm reading. And then finally you figure out that this is the main character who has just totally put on a different persona and is like putting on this like giant show for like a whole other reason, and like they're like storming the castle in some other way. I mean, I can't remember exactly what the whole like the trick of it was, but I had to wait those 15 pages of like, what on this straight earth is going on? And then when like that landed, I just like this like wild joy that surges, so to me that feeling is so fabulous. I really am willing to put up with so much like lack of surety. And so I guess maybe I'd say, like, in order to take care of my readers, I guess I try to provide them with enough clues textually to say like, no, trust me, no, I really do know what I'm doing, like, just keep going, you're gonna get there, and when you get there the payoff will be so much better than if I told you right now. Okay.
I love it. All right. It looks like we are nearly out of time. Is there anything else you would like to add that we have not already discussed?
I don't know. I feel like I've told you so many things about myself, but
It's been so delightful. I just have loved this conversation.
yes, this was wonderful. So much for the great
Yeah. It's
questions.
too bad you're not here in person and we can't hang out after hours
Right?
at the
I
convention.
know.
All right. Well, Alaya, you are so talented and just a delight to listen to. And we really appreciate you joining us this year at LTUE. Do you have any partying contact or like websites you would like to leave with any viewers, or would you like to just say goodbye?
Just my personal website is alayadonjohnson.com, and my email address is there, and feel free to get in touch with me after this, and check out my books or buy them for your library or personal collection. Thank you so much
Perfect.
for having me here. This has been great.
Thank you.